In this video, we'll discuss how a remarkable journey of fearless leadership assisted the foundation for the most powerful country on Earth. George Washington is often celebrated as a key figure in American history, but does he deserve all that praise? Is George Washington overappreciated, underappreciated, properly appreciated? Let me know in the comments down below. Do we think too high, low, or just right about President George Washington? While George Washington is often celebrated as a key figure in American history, a closer examination of his life reveals a complex perspective and a new view on the most powerful leader in the history of the world. Before we go further, if you're interested in U.S. history just like me, please consider subscribing to the channel, as it would help me out a lot if you share my interest in U.S. history. Imagine being the oldest of 6 children in the Washington household, where every day was a new lesson where you would learn new responsibilities about how to lead a life. George Washington faced these pressures every single day from a young age, shaping him into the fantastic leader that we know and love today. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. At just the age of 11, his father, Augustine Washington, passed away, making him the, quote, man of the house. Washington teamed up with his mother, Mary Ball, to keep the household family farm in shape and well-toiled so it could grow new crops, which they used as a food source. Throughout his teenage years, George Washington worked tirelessly with his mother, Mary Ball, on working on the family farm, so this meant he didn't have much time to receive much of an education. He has now the modern-day equivalent of a grade school education. Despite these challenges, President Washington developed a strong work ethic and a passion to learn that helped him shape the nation. At just 11 years old, George Washington inherited 10 slaves from his father. That really reveals the reality and complexities and the troubling times that he lived through during his upbringing. While he was still a child, this responsibility would shape his views and decisions he made in many, many ways, laying the groundwork for the future and shaping his legacy as a leader. George Washington was not only an exceptionally good president, but his experience as a founding father before are just as, if not more, impressive, and definitely much more founding and much more important to the founding of these United States. In 1775, George Washington remained hopeful that a Declaration of Independence could be achieved without resorting to war, but after the battles of Lexington and the Battle of Concord, as well as the Siege of Boston, that plan and that hope quickly faded. The American War for Independence was on, led by, you guessed it, George Washington. After suffering several defeats, George Washington led his troops in what he felt was a Hail Mary option. He led his troops, including future President James Monroe, across the icy Delaware River in the dead of night the day after Christmas during a cold, chilly December storm. This proved to be the single most essential part in gaining independence from Great Britain. The British, believing they had already secured victory, were caught off guard by Washington and his troops. Washington and his forces achieved a crucial victory, which proved to be a significant morale boost to the United States. Despite George Washington's initial anti-war stance, he ultimately made a bold decision to attack British forces, highlighting his exceptional leadership and commitment to the cause of American independence. As this was happening, the United States officially became a country with the signing of the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. However, George Washington never got around to signing it because he was too busy fighting overseas. We forgive you, George, don't worry. George Washington was unanimously elected the first president of the United States thanks to his exemplary leadership displayed during the Revolutionary War and his ability to unite the nation, which no other person and no other founding father had anywhere close to that of George Washington. George Washington's support for the Bill of Rights was instrumental in solidifying the principles of the Constitution of the United States, protecting and ensuring individual liberties, and shaping the nation's democratic foundation. George Washington established numerous precedents for the United States president, most notably the two-term tradition, which has significantly influenced the role of the presidency in the United States. George Washington outlined American democracy by retiring after 8 years in office, confirming that he did not want to be a king. Thus, a two-term president was set and respected for the next 150 years before becoming law in 1951. George Washington's retirement in 1797 underscored his commitment to American democracy, as he believed in the fundamental right of the people to choose their own leader. Despite making several attempts to retire, George Washington's exceptional leadership skills led to significant pressure from the American people to continue serving. His love for his country compelled him to continue, and he even served in the John Adams presidency as commander-in-chief. Tragically, on December 14th, 1799, George Washington, at the age of 67, passed away from complications from epiglottitis, a condition that was not well understood by doctors at that time. In an attempt to treat him, they resorted to bloodletting, which caused Washington to lose over 40% of his blood, ultimately resulting in his death. In this video, we'll discuss what makes John Quincy Adams revered as one of the most accomplished presidents among historians, but unknown among many Americans. JQ is regarded as one of the most intelligent presidents in terms of IQ, but many would agree that that did not turn into incredible White House accomplishments. After controversially taking office in 1825, he worked tirelessly to achieve the America that he envisioned. Before we go further, if you share my interest in U.S. history, please consider clicking that subscribe button down below. It apparently really helps with the algorithm to grow our community. And if you've already done so, thank you for joining the community. Now let's get into it. One of John Quincy Adams' most famous accomplishments happened after his presidency, in the Amistad case. In 1839, a group of Africans from the country of Sierra Leone had been kidnapped and sold into the slave trade in Havana, Cuba, but they rebelled and took control over a ship called the Amistad. The U.S. government wanted to send them back to their captors, but Adams fought for their freedom in front of the United States Supreme Court. Adams argued that these men were free people who had the right to defend themselves. Adams and the would-be slaves won the case, and their captives were allowed to return home to Sierra Leone. They killed the captain and 2 other crew members of the Amistad ship. Adams led this attack, which showed his commitment to American justice and human rights. JQ, like his father, never owned slaves, and often called for the abolishment of slavery. Both JQ and his father John agreed that the revolution would not be complete until all slaves are freed. During his presidency, John Quincy Adams focused on improving the country's education and infrastructure. He believed that developments such as roads, canals, and bridges would help Americans connect, grow the economy, and improve the nation's footprint. Adams also wanted to create a national university in scientific research to make America a leader in knowledge and education. Many historians agree he was quite successful in this endeavor. While many of his ideas were not popular at the time, they were ahead of their era and showed his vision for a stronger and smarter nation. Adams became president in 1825, following the election of 1824, one of the most controversial elections in U.S. history. 4 candidates ran for president that year: Adams, Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, and William Crawford. No candidate won enough votes to become president outright through an electoral college majority. This meant that the United States House of Representatives would decide the president. Andrew Jackson had by far the most votes from the public, winning both the national popular vote and the most electoral votes. However, somehow, Adams was awarded the presidency with the help of Henry Clay, another candidate who supported him. What? Clay ran against him, didn't he? Yes, he did, but only the top 3 candidates would advance to the vote in the House, leaving out Clay, because Clay did not get enough votes from the public. He was eliminated from the House vote, meaning Clay could no longer become president. Henry Clay hated Andrew Jackson, so he supported Adams once he was out of the race. Adams struck a deal with Clay that Clay would be the Secretary of State if he convinced his friends in the House to vote Adams into office. In this era of American history, being Secretary of State was the most common pathway for becoming the next president. That plan backfired. Make no mistake, Adams did become president and serve out a full term, but Clay never would, despite running 5 times. When Adams was sworn in as president, many people accused him of making a corrupt bargain with Clay to get the support in the House and win the presidency. This made it hard for Adams to lead, as his legacy was highly shadowed by this controversial election, and they were angry about the election, even some of his supporters. The controversy hurt the Adams presidency, and it showed how complicated democracy can be and taught important lessons about the fairness and security of elections. This, quote, corrupt bargain would haunt the Adams presidency. Right, as for the negatives in the Adams presidency, he signed the Tariff of 1828, or as critics like to call it, the Tariff of Abominations. This tariff raised taxes on imported manufactured goods, hoping to reduce foreign competition with American manufacturing. Southerners, arguing that the tariff enhanced the interests of the northern manufacturing industry at their expense, referred to it as the Tariff of Abominations. Remember, both the North and South were beginning to grow more divided over issues, particularly slavery, which led to the Civil War 30 years after this tariff, but this tariff was one of the first major disputes between the North and the South. The tariff stains the Adams legacy because it sparked division between the North and the South, which would not heal until the Civil War was over. Even the challenges of his presidency, like the disputed election of 1824, added to his story as a leader who shaped the nation in many ways, especially his ability to guide the nation through very difficult times. Remarkably, John Quincy Adams was photographed in 1823, and that photo still exists. It's worth $300,000. Right, yeah, a little out of my budget. John Quincy Adams collapsed on the floor of the House chamber from a stroke and was carried to the Speaker's room, where 2 days later, he would die at the age of 80. Today, the Adams legacy inspires many people to stand up for what they believe in and work towards a better future. Was Andrew Jackson a champion of the common man, or was he just an ill-tempered politician whose poor actions left a long-lasting impact on Americans today? In this video, we'll unravel complexities in his legacy that still spark debate between Americans today, making him one of the most controversial figures in our history. I will share 3 aspects of his life that will change your perspective on the 7th president, and maybe one more little bonus fun fact at the end of the video, so stick around to see what that one is. If you share my interest in U.S. presidential history content, please give this video a like down below, as it would help us grow our community. If you've already done so, thank you. Now let's jump into it. Remember how in last week's video I talked about the heated election of 1824? Well, Jackson and his supporters were furious. They felt the victory was stolen from them by Adams and Clay. Jackson knew he wanted a rematch against Adams in 1828. Spoiler alert, he won that rematch. Just months before taking office, after winning the election, Jackson's wife Rachel died. President Jackson attributes her death to the stress coming from heated attacks from the Adams campaign in this election. Mrs. Jackson's death and the heated election of 1824 built Jackson's controversial character arc. Known for being passionate and quick to fight, Jackson often faced challenges head-on, which earned him the nickname Old Hickory because he was so tough. His temper helped him become a strong and confident leader, but it also led to decisions that caused problems. For example, he didn't trust the Second Bank of the United States and worked hard to shut it down, which caused money troubles during the Panic of 1837, the worst economic crisis in American history to that point. Jackson also believed strongly in the power of the federal government and used force to stop South Carolina from trying to secede from the Union, which created more tension between states, leading to the nullification crisis, an unnecessary dispute between South Carolina and the rest of the country. Jackson, that being his home state, South Carolina, and his strong personality made this issue far worse than it needed to be. Moreover, he ignored the effect of his actions against the Indian population in the United States. Remember, at that time, only rich white men had any voice in American government. Jackson was even willing to fight duels, both literally and figuratively. His most notable duel was that against Charles Dickinson. In that duel, Jackson was wounded, but did fatally wound Charles Dickinson. Some people admire his boldness, but others felt as though he acted like a dictator. In the end, Jackson's personality made him a leader who both helped and hurt the country, leaving behind a legacy people still argue about today. But let me know your stance in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. Andrew Jackson was called the champion of the common man because he supported everyday people, not just the rich and powerful. Before Jackson, most leaders came from wealthy families, but Jackson grew up in the middle class and worked hard to succeed. He believed that regular people, like farmers and workers, should have more say in the American government. Jackson helped change the voting law so that all white men could vote, even if they didn't own land. Hey, progress is progress, right? He also fought against the Second Bank of the U.S. because he believed it only helped rich people and hurt farmers and small business owners. Jackson's policies gave many people hope that they could have a voice in their country, which begs the question, maybe he wasn't so bad. He held big events at the White House where regular citizens were invited, which made people feel important and they could feel a personal connection to their president. However, not everyone agreed with him, especially Native Americans and African Americans, who were hurt by his decisions, most notably the Indian Removal Act, but more on that later in this video. Many Americans saw him as a president who cared about the common man, and his leadership changed how America felt about democracy. Speaking of the Indian Removal Act, it is the ultimate stain on his legacy I mentioned earlier. The Indian Removal Act is one of the most discriminatory events to ever take place in the so-called free world. In 1830, Jackson signed a law forcing Native American tribes to leave their homes in the southeast and move west of the Mississippi River. Jackson said it would help settlers claim more land in the west, but it caused great suffering for those affected. The Louisiana Purchase had already happened, so sending people just west of the Mississippi River wouldn't actually expand the nation's footprint or help them reach new land. Many tribes like the Cherokee were pushed off their land even though they had lived there for generations. This led to the Trail of Tears, a terrible journey where thousands of Native Americans were forced to walk hundreds of miles to new land. Most with little clothing on in chilly winter months, and some without shoes. Along the way, many people died from hunger, disease, and harsh weather. Jackson's decision to support this law showed that he cared more about growing the nation's footprint and economy than the rights of Native Americans, which sparked division throughout the country. The Indian Removal Act stained the Jackson's legacy because it ignored the suffering of others. The Jackson legacy serves as a reminder that even strong leaders make decisions that cause great harm. Right, on a later note, that fun fact I teased earlier. Andrew Jackson cared deeply about the nation's economy, often putting it above other issues. When Jackson came into office, the national debt was $58 million. During his presidency, Jackson paid off the national debt by himself. The national debt was down to $0, and there was a surplus. Good job, Andrew. What did he do with all the extra money? Well, he divided it evenly between the states, of course. In 1845, Jackson developed edema, which is a severe heart failure that killed him on June 8, 1845, at the age of 78. The 15th president, James Buchanan, is remembered in our history as one of the worst. But why? Well, he crumbled under the pressure of making important decisions when many Americans called on him to act and be the leader that he promised to be in 1856. He simply was not that guy. Buchanan, a northerner from Pennsylvania, often sided with pro-slavery Southerners and attempted to instill slavery nationwide, which he did by supporting one of the worst Supreme Court rulings in our history, the Dred Scott decision. We'll get into all of this stuff later in this video, so be sure to stick around till the very end. And if you have not done so and you've been enjoying my content recently, please consider subscribing to the channel, as it would help us out a lot. And if you've already done so, thank you and welcome back. Now let's jump into it. Before we can criticize Buchanan's presidency, let's name a little bit of good. Not much of it, but let's give Buchanan credit for the annexation of Utah and Nevada territories. The land in the territories serves an important role in the United States infrastructure and economic development. Roughly 7 million people live in the land that Buchanan was so influential in acquiring. The United States obtained a strong grip on these territories after the Mexican-American War, and Buchanan sent troops to Utah to ensure Mexico could never reclaim the land. Thank you, James. Buchanan was a poor decision-maker as president. He crumbled under the pressure of knowing that every executive decision he made had the potential to divide the nation even further. When many Americans called on him to act, he took no action, no responsibility for his failures. His poor leadership abilities significantly harmed the Union because he was unable to serve as the unifying figure Americans thought they were getting when they voted for him. After Abraham Lincoln was elected in 1860, while Buchanan was still president in that lame duck period, Southern states threatened to secede from the Union. Buchanan did nothing to prevent secession. He basically said that the South can do whatever they want to. This perspective has led to Buchanan being despised by the American people. When Buchanan did act, he usually sided with the South. Buchanan largely supported slavery and interpreted the Constitution as protecting the rights of slave owners to purchase slaves. The Dred Scott decision, officially known as Dred Scott v. Sanford in 1857, was a historically controversial Supreme Court ruling that intensified national tensions over slavery in the United States. Dred Scott was an enslaved African-American man who had lived for a time in free territories with his enslaver, Dr. John Emerson. Scott sued for his freedom on the grounds that his residence in the free land made him a free man. However, the Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, ruled against Scott. The decision declared that African Americans, whether enslaved or free, were not citizens of the United States, and therefore had no right to sue in a federal court. Furthermore, the court struck down the Missouri Compromise of 1820, arguing that Congress had no authority to prohibit slavery in these territories, essentially making slavery illegal in all U.S.-owned land. Buchanan had just taken office in March of 1857 and played a controversial role in the case. Although presidents are expected to remain separate from judicial decisions, Buchanan privately pressured at least one Northern justice, Robert Grier, to join the Southern majority in the decision. Buchanan hoped a decisive ruling would settle the slavery question and preserve the Union by instilling slavery nationwide. In his inaugural address, delivered just 2 days before the decision was announced, Buchanan hinted that the Supreme Court would soon resolve the slavery issue, revealing his knowledge of the impending ruling. Many in the North saw it as evidence of pro-slavery conspiracy at the highest levels of government, while Southerners viewed it as a validation of their rights. Buchanan's involvement damaged his credibility and worsened the North-South divide. His support of the ruling alienated many Northerners and contributed to the collapse of the Democratic Party's unity. In the following few decades, the country would see 2 different Democratic parties. The decision also energized the emerging Republican Party. Ultimately, the Dred Scott decision is widely regarded as one of, if not the worst Supreme Court decisions in our history, not only for its moral implications, but also for its legal reasoning and political consequences. Abraham Lincoln, the great emancipator, the man who preserved the Union and officially abolished slavery. Sit back, relax as we enjoy and explore the legacy with the most talented man to ever serve as United States President. Before we get into it, please subscribe to the channel if you have not already, as it's the best way to support this work that we do. And if you already have, thank you for your continued support. Now let's jump into it. The U.S. presidential election of 1860 was a turning point that exposed the nation's deepest conflicts and set the stage for the Civil War. Abraham Lincoln, representing the anti-slavery Republican Party, won the presidency without carrying a single Southern state, highlighting the regional divide over slavery and states' rights. In many Deep South states, Lincoln wasn't even on the ballot. In the one state where he did appear, he got just 1.1% of the popular vote. The Democratic Party was split into the Northern Democratic Party and the Southern Democratic Party. They nominated Stephen A. Douglas and John C. Breckinridge, respectively, and their partisan split underscored the nation's inability to work together regarding the slavery issue. Lincoln's victory, achieved with less than 40% of the popular vote, but a decisive electoral majority, was perceived by many Southerners as a direct threat to their way of life, and they viewed slavery as a constitutional right. This perception led to the secession of 7 Southern states before Lincoln's inauguration in March of 1861. The secession served as a warning sign of the Union's collapse. The election also marked the emergence of the Republican Party as a dominant force committed to ending slavery. Until 1913, only one Democrat was elected president. Many of Lincoln's predecessors made compromise after compromise as their attempt to keep the nation united. Ultimately, the 1860 election made clear the nation's failure to resolve its most contentious issue through political means, leading to the Civil War. The suspension of habeas corpus during the Civil War was one of the most significant constitutional crises in United States history, and that was Lincoln's big blemish on his legacy. Habeas corpus, a legal principle protecting individuals from arbitrary prison, is enshrined in the Constitution but allows for suspension, when in cases of rebellion or invasion the public safety may require it. Abraham Lincoln, confronted with a rebellion in the form of Southern secession, authorized the suspension unilaterally in 1861, especially in Maryland and other border states where Confederate sympathies threatened Union control. His decision bypassed Congress, prompting intense legal and political controversy, particularly after the arrest of John Merriman, a Confederate sympathizer whose case Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled unconstitutional in Ex parte Merriman. Lincoln ignored the ruling, asserting the necessity of preserving the Union above strict following legal norms. His rationale echoed the idea that the Constitution was the most powerful document in the nation, but it must remain flexible enough to ensure the nation's survival. Critics viewed the decision as an executive overreach, while supporters argued it was a fair response to an existential threat. The episode highlighted the ambiguous boundary between the executive power and individual rights during wartime. Lincoln later sought and received congressional approval, cementing the precedent and expanded authority. Ultimately, the suspension of habeas corpus under Lincoln revealed the enduring dilemma of how a democracy preserves itself without sacrificing the values of the founding documents. Abraham Lincoln preserved the Union during the Civil War through a blend of constitutional bravery and strategic ideas that reshaped the American presidency. Faced with the unprecedented secession of Southern states, Lincoln perceived the conflict as a test of the viability of the democratic self-government. He maintained that the Union was rooted in the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, and thus no state had the right to secede. Lincoln's use of executive power, including the suspension of habeas corpus, the blockade of Southern ports, and the expansion of military without congressional approval, demonstrated his willingness to stretch constitutional norms in an attempt to preserve the Union. At the same time, he navigated complex political structures, keeping border states loyal to the Union and balancing military power. His signing of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 reoriented the war as simply fighting against slavery. Moreover, Lincoln deterred European powers from officially recognizing the Confederacy as a country. Lincoln's communication, especially through speeches like the Gettysburg Address, paved a new path forward for his constituents. He also ensured the 1864 presidential election proceeded despite the war, reaffirming democratic legitimacy under the gravest of circumstances. Lincoln was successfully reelected in 1864, but Confederate states did not vote. By the time of his assassination, Lincoln had asserted the political groundwork for reunification and constitutional transformation. His leadership preserved not only the territorial integrity of the United States, but also the democratic ideals at its core. Lincoln's signing of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 was a pivotal moment in American history that officially abolished slavery in all territories and land owned by the United States. While limited in immediate scope, freeing enslaved people in Confederate territories angered Southerners, but it realigned the Union with morals from the Declaration of Independence. As mentioned, the proclamation discouraged European powers, particularly Britain and France, from recognizing or aiding the Confederacy, as they were reluctant to support a slaveholding state. Foreign powers were strikingly uninvolved in the United States Civil War. Domestically, the war continued to rage on, and after Lincoln's great work to win the war for the Union, he was assassinated. Though criticized by some as a wartime necessity rather than a principal law, the proclamation laid the legal groundwork for the eventual abolition of slavery through the 13th Amendment. Lincoln's careful timing demonstrated his sense of political strategy, ensuring the proclamation would not appear to be an act of desperation. Its signing redefined Lincoln's presidency, elevating him from a cautious constitutionalist to a visionary, courageous leader. In both symbolic and practical terms, the Emancipation Proclamation reshaped the greatest president in our history. On April 14, 1865, Lincoln celebrated victory in the war by attending a production of Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington. Lincoln said, "They don't think anything of it," while laughing hysterically. He was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth. Booth then slashed Major Rathbone with a knife before jumping to the stage, breaking his leg in the process. Booth was on the run for 2 weeks before being trapped in a burning barn, then later shot by Boston Corbett. The conspiracies and complexities of Lincoln's assassination are beyond the scope of this video. In short, Lincoln's death the next morning left the nation shocked and heartbroken. Woodrow Wilson was the first president of the United States to visit Europe while in office, as he was deeply involved in the signing of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 near the end of World War I. Woodrow Wilson getting the country involved in World War I begs the question, can he really be remembered as a champion of democracy abroad if he upheld segregation and racist policies at home? Remember that question, as it is key to his legacy and important to what we will be discussing in this video today. Before we go further, if you've been enjoying my U.S. history content recently, please leave me a like and subscribe. If you've already done so, thank you. Now let's jump into it. Let's begin with the way Wilson became President of the United States. He cruised to the Democratic nomination in 1912. But as for the Republican side, sitting President William Howard Taft ran for re-election, but ex-President Theodore Roosevelt ran against him for the nomination. Taft was nominated barely, but Roosevelt was furious, so he and his supporters stormed out of the convention in rage. Roosevelt started the Bull Moose Party, and many Republicans voted for Roosevelt, splitting the party's vote between the two. 3 weeks prior to the election, Roosevelt was shot by John Trank while giving a speech in Milwaukee. The bullet hit the folded speech paper in his pocket as well as his eyeglass case, saving his life. 2 weeks later, and 6 days before the election, Taft's running mate and sitting vice president, James Sherman, died. The poor unity within the Republican Party and internal challenges of their campaigns allowed Wilson to cruise to the White House. But what did he do as Commander-in-Chief? Let's find out. Woodrow Wilson was the 28th President of the United States, serving from 1913 to 1921. One of his biggest achievements was leading the country through World War I and helping shape the peace process afterwards. He pushed for the creation of the League of Nations, which was meant to keep peace in the world, though the U.S. never joined. At home, Wilson passed major progressive reforms, including the Federal Reserve Act, which helped stabilize the banking system. He also signed laws that limited child labor and improved working conditions for laborers. Wilson lowered tariffs and introduced a federal income tax through the 16th Amendment. Despite these successes, his presidency had major flaws. He supported segregation in the federal government and held racist beliefs that hurt African Americans. Wilson also faced criticisms for limiting free speech during the war through laws like the Espionage and Sedition Acts. Overall, Wilson's presidency was a mix of important reforms, global leadership, and deep contradictions. He initially attempted to keep the country out of war, as it was one of his major campaign promises when running for re-election in 1916. However, he ultimately entered the war, and the nation was divided on whether that was the right call, so he justified his decision, or at least tried to. Rapid intensification of the war meant governments had to be efficient in response to avoid disaster. Therefore, the War Industries Board and Food Administration were formed in an attempt to defend themselves in war efforts. Additionally, Wilson passed the Espionage Act in 1917 and the Sedition Act in 1918 to silence anti-war opposition. The law limited free speech and led to arrests of activists worldwide. Finally, Wilson struggled to get U.S. Senate support for the Treaty of Versailles, and lack of support in Congress explains why the U.S. never joined the League of Nations. As for the domestic side, Wilson mightily struggled. His administration resegregated parts of the federal government, which angered African Americans and civil rights leaders. Wilson passed major reforms such as the aforementioned Federal Reserve Act and Clayton Antitrust Act. Still, he failed to support women's suffrage until very late in his presidency, but by that time, his wife Edith was basically president. We'll get into that later. In 1918, a global pandemic devastated the world, that being the Spanish flu, which hit the United States hard, killing hundreds of thousands of Americans, and the Wilson administration struggled to respond in the midst of war. As for Wilson's personal health, he suffered a severe stroke in 1919, leaving him unable to properly discharge the duties of President of the United States. So his wife Edith took over much control of her husband's duties. This raised questions of who was really running the country. Before then, Woodrow Wilson proposed the League of Nations as part of his 14 points plan for world peace after World War I.
He believed it would prevent future wars by encouraging diplomacy and cooperation among countries. However, the U.S. Senate rejected the treaty, and America never joined, which weakened the League's power and global influence. Earlier in his presidency, in 1913, Wilson signed the Federal Reserve Act, which created the Federal Reserve System to stabilize the economy and control inflation. It established a central bank, with regional branches to manage interest rates and money supply. This act became one of the most important parts of America's financial system and still plays a major role in 2025. One of the greatest criticisms towards Wilson was his support of segregation, and he allowed racist policies in federal offices. His administration rolled back progress for Black Americans and caused great harm to civil rights efforts. The climax of Wilson's presidency was signing the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. This treaty officially ended World War I and placed harsh punishments on Germany, including taking away land, limiting its military, and demanding large payments. Wilson believed the treaty would bring peace, but many people thought it was too harsh and would lead to more conflict in the future. However, every nation with the exception of China ultimately signed the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson had spent months in Europe negotiating the terms. As mentioned, he was the first U.S. president to travel overseas while in office. His leadership at the peace talks showed that the United States had become a powerful nation with a strong voice in global decisions. However, Wilson faced strong opposition at home from people who believed the treaty gave too much power to other countries. He gave many speeches trying to convince Americans to support it, but his health began to fail. The Treaty of Versailles marked a turning point where America had to decide whether to stay involved in world affairs or return to isolation. Wilson never supported equal rights for women or for African Americans, harming his reputation in present day. Remember the question prompt from the beginning of this video? As a refresher, I asked, can Wilson truly be remembered as a champion of democracy abroad when he actively supported segregation and racist policies at home?
Jimmy Carter, the president you know and love, the first president to reach the 100-year mark and the peanut farmer from Georgia. During his 36,614 days on Earth, Carter pursued rights, hard work, and kindness, and today I will discuss the 5 major parts of his life, from his presidency to his 43-year post-presidency. We'll talk about the Camp David Accords, impact on human rights, the economic failures of the 70s, the Iranian hostage crisis, and his post-presidency, all to answer the question, was Jimmy Carter's presidency a failure, or is he just admired for his post-presidency? We're going to find out, but first, if you've been enjoying my U.S. history content recently, please subscribe to the channel. It's just the very best way to support the hard work I do for these videos. We are very close to reaching 100 subs, and it would be a huge assist if you could help me get there. Now let's get into it. Firstly, the Camp David Accord was one of Carter's most important accomplishments. It was a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel. For decades, those two nations had been enemies and had fought in several wars. Carter invited Egyptian President Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin to Camp David, the presidential retreat in Maryland in 1978. After nearly 2 weeks of difficult negotiations, Carter helped both sides reach a historic peace deal. Egypt became the first Arab nation to officially recognize Israel, and Israel agreed to withdraw from the Sinai Peninsula. This was a huge achievement in the Middle East, which had been filled with conflict for generations. Carter's patience, personal involvement, and skill as a mediator were key to the agreement. Although peace in the Middle East was not fully solved, this deal has endured as a landmark achievement. Many historians still see the Camp David Accord as a highlight of his presidency. Second, another major part of Carter's legacy was his strong emphasis on human rights. Unlike many presidents before him, Carter made promoting human rights a central part of his U.S. foreign policy. He spoke out against dictatorships in Latin America, the Soviet Union, and Africa. Carter believed that America should set an example by supporting freedom and justice around the world. This approach earned him respect among people who were fighting for democracy and civil liberties. However, some critics argued that his focus on human rights made it harder for the U.S. to maintain strong relationships with countries that were important for security reasons. For example, ties with Iran and Nicaragua became strained. Still, Carter's commitment to human rights helped shape how future presidents thought about America's role in the world. He shifted the conversation from only protecting U.S. interests to also protecting human dignity. Third, on the negative side, Carter's presidency was also defined by serious economic problems. The late 1970s were marked by stagflation, which meant high unemployment, high inflation, and slow growth all at once. On top of all of that, energy shortages caused long lines at gas stations across the country. Carter tried to address the problem by encouraging Americans to save energy and look for alternative sources like solar power. In a famous speech, sometimes called the Malaise speech, he told Americans that the nation was facing a crisis of confidence. While he meant to inspire change, many people felt he was blaming citizens instead of offering solutions. Carter's efforts to tackle the energy crisis, including creating the Department of Energy, were forward-thinking but unpopular at times. His presidency became associated with economic struggles and frustration. These difficulties weakened his popularity and opened the door for Ronald Reagan's election in 1980. Fourth, what Carter's presidency is most remembered for. Perhaps the most damaging event of his term was the Iran hostage crisis. In 1979, Iranian revolutionaries stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran and took 52 American diplomats and citizens hostage. They held the hostages for 444 days, refusing to release them until Carter left office. Carter worked tirelessly behind the scenes to secure their freedom through diplomacy, but his efforts failed for most of his term. A rescue mission also ended in disaster when U.S. helicopters crashed in the desert, killing 8 soldiers. The crisis made Carter appear weak and ineffective to many Americans. It dominated the news and overshadowed many of his other accomplishments. The hostages were finally released moments after Ronald Reagan was sworn in as president, which humiliated Carter politically. This crisis left a lasting mark on his legacy and showed how international events can define a presidency. Despite the failure, Carter's determination to avoid full-scale war with Iran reflected his cautious and peace-focused approach. Finally, my favorite part of his legacy, his post-presidency, which became one of the most admired in American history. After leaving office, he dedicated himself to humanitarian causes around the world. He founded the Carter Center, which works to promote democracy, monitor elections, fight disease, and improve human rights globally. Jimmy and his wife Rosalind also became well known for volunteering with Habitat for Humanity, helping build homes for families in need. In 2002, Carter received the Nobel Peace Prize for his decades of working promoting peace and human rights. Many people came to respect him for more what he accomplished after the White House than during his time in it. His post-presidency redefined what former presidents can do with their influence and energy. Carter's dedication to helping others left a powerful example of leadership rooted in compassion. Well, Carter is often regarded by historians as a below-average president, but his impact on humanity is undisputable.